John Phelan, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of the New York Stock Exchange. Are you glad you used the word meltdown?
Oh yes, I think it was right to the point. And one of the reasons we'd thought about it before is that a number of events could come together almost like a waterfall, but during that same period, Chernobyl had happened, and so we were trying to look for something that people could envision mentally as to what was happening, and I think that meltdown seemed to be the most appropriate word for it, and I think it created an image that really was what had happened, and we wanted to build that image in a person's mind so that who didn't know all the complications and ramifications for the market and everything. So came up with the word meltdown, and I'm glad I used it. I would use it again.
How soon in advance had you thought it out?
Well, about a year before. In September of 1986, the market for 2 days was off about 108 points, and became very, very worried that that wasn't during an expiration of a contract or anything like that, and that there was enough volatility being built in on an intraday basis that if it was off 108 points, why couldn't it go 200 or 300 points? And so we began to talk to the people who were involved in all these different products that go under a generic name of program trading, and the more we talked about them, the more we talked about the waterfall effect, because they're all mathematically inclined, and they all use formulas, and they all hit certain points, and even if they're acting completely separately, they all come to the conclusion about certain points. And so all you have to do is tick those points, and it sets off another chain reaction, and then another chain reaction as you hit another point, and another chain reaction. And so it is much like a meltdown in a nuclear facility or something like that. And each chain reaction begins to feed on the other, and the consequences of it build and so forth. The only thing that somebody asked me, they said that after a meltdown, there's a period of desolation, what called nuclear winter, and did I think nuclear winter was to follow? And I said, no. I said I thought already there were some green shoots popping up from the ground. And,
you can't pick up an article about you, at least I haven't seen one, where maybe this is another chain reaction, where people don't say, out of this horrible day came a real star, and it's John Phelan. You've seen those same articles. What's your reaction when you see them?
Well, I don't know. I think that in life you spend a good bit of your life training and trying to know and understand what you do and how it relates to the rest of the world. And on the 19th and in that period that followed, we really did what experience taught us to do, and a little luck and a little blessing from the Lord. And I think on that day, at the end of it, what we tried to do is to go out before the public and to present as honestly as possible what had happened, teeing up the seriousness of it, but also trying to give it a balance, to saying that yes, this was terrible. It was one of the worst experiences in modern history of markets. But on the other hand, fortunately, it didn't happen at some other point in time, that the economy was still good, that other things were good, that inflation rate was down, and so forth. So there's a balance to what had happened, and it probably isn't the end of the world, even though it's a serious event. And I think that kind of literally trying to be honest and open about what we saw and what we did. Yes, we had some problems, yet you don't go from 180 million shares a day to 600 million shares without problems in the system. The theoretical capacity, for instance, of the whole securities industry was about 450 million shares. We were 160 million over theoretical capacity. So when people say, did you have problems? Of course you had problems. But the important thing is we got through it, number one, and number two, that the problems were not overwhelming. In other words, for most of the period of time, for most of the people entering that market, the problems did not affect them at all. And so I think that you're not aware, and I'm still not aware of I don't think I'm a star or anything like that, but I think that you are a spokesman for certainly a public institution, and I think you owe the public, whether it be here or overseas, an honest evaluation of what you've seen and what we've done. And we try to give that, and I think that it's as simple as that. And so I suppose it's a culmination of all your years of experience and everything else that you go through that, and you try to present a balanced view of concern, but it isn't nuclear winter. There are green shoots in that desolation.
I want to ask you about the New York Stock Exchange in a minute, but before we do that, I want to ask you about your experience during this time with all the publicity, all the television exposure, all the copy that's been written. What do you think of all that, and how's the media done in this process? What did you learn about the media?
Well, I think that number one is, you know, life plays many tricks on you, and one of the things is that I am really in life quite a private person, and for somebody like myself, all of a sudden you couldn't be more public, and to be out there is rather an ironic turn of events, all right? And I suppose it has to be the time and the place and the job and so forth, so that I still view that as something that has to be done. Something that comes with part of the job, something that we owe to all the constituents and people that have an interest in our market and everything else. You also owe them a leadership role. You just can't sit back and hide and say, gee, something has happened, you have to get out there. You have to provide leadership to the institution itself. And I think you have to portray honestly, as we said before, those things that happen. As far as the press is concerned, I think that the coverage I've had, you know, good experience with the press over a number of years now, and I think their coverage in this case was excellent. After a while, it began to worry the same bone, you know, and after a month or 2 months of talking about the same subject, you begin to talk about angels on the head of a pin and things like that. But I think during the crisis itself, the coverage was quite good, very responsible, and I think they asked the right questions. I think there was a balance in what they said and did. And I think their portraying of it to the rest of the world had a balance as well. And so that also I was quite amazed at the enormous reach now of the press. I had several interesting experiences. One was I had 2 directors that were in Japan during this period of time. And quite separately, one in different cities than the other, turned on the radio and there was the press conference and everything else, which gives to show you the exposure worldwide that these things have now. And then secondly, I had somebody who stopped me at a dinner one night and said, you know, I recognize your face, and the reason I do that is because I was in Kenya for 2 weeks on a photographic safari, and when I came out of the bush, we went to Nairobi, and as I passed the newsstand, I looked, and there was your picture on the front page of the paper talking about the. And so the worldwide coverage and the worldwide interest in this is absolutely staggering and still absolutely amazes me. I mean, if I go still today to England or to Spain or any of the both places on the continent, I mean, people, the name is almost instantaneously recognized, and people are interested in what happened and everything else, and say a lot of very nice things. And so I think from that point, it's quite pleasing. On the other hand, I would hope that in 1988 there's somebody else in another field who is prominent in doing other things. I like to do those things, but I think that under the circumstances, you know, it was quite trying. But the press was very, very good, really well.
You say you're a private person.
Yeah.
What does that mean to you?
What that means is that I think that I have to push myself to do the public kinds of things. Years ago, because of the job, I began to do public speaking. I didn't particularly like it. Yet on the other hand, I felt that it was essential to do it. And also because of my years in trading, the audience was kind of like a crowd in trading, and in trading you try to get control of that crowd so that you can do and perform your function the way you want. And I found that speaking was the same way. Began to look at an audience out, whether it's 30 people or 1 person, or I've done luncheons with 1,000 people. It's absolutely amazing in Texas. But you're out there, you're trying to hold the attention of that audience, and as you're talking, you're going to say, you know, I wonder if I'm really interesting them, and you begin to change and twist it a little bit to see if you can get their interest and hold it. And every once in a while, I'd have a tendency, I'd see somebody over there who was talking to the person next to me or something, and I begin to talk right at them, and I'm going to say, I'm going to get their attention to do that. So it becomes kind of a challenge for you, and after a while, you get over the shock, I think, of being a private person and not exposing yourself to everybody. You get up there, you got to answer all kinds of questions that come into you, And so somebody described it one time as mental tennis, and I think that that's a good expression for it. All right, suddenly the challenge of it begins to stimulate you. And secondly, after a while in doing that, I found that I was learning more from them than I was giving to them. And that was a big help for me. And different parts of the country you'd go to, you'd begin to get a feel for how different people felt in different parts of the country. I mean, after all, New York is not the real world. I mean, it's a world unto its own. And if you want to find out what's going on in the United States, you have to get out around and do that. So secondly is that you're not used to the scrutiny of everybody, all right? I mean, it's rather disconcerting to walk by a newsstand and see your picture on the front of a magazine, all right? I think I was brought up that in a world which said that you made the papers when you were born, when you were married, when you died, and most of the other time it would be nice if you just kept out of the way and did that. Well, obviously I'm in a different world than that today. So I think that by those kinds of things, I mean a private person. You keep your thoughts reasonably to yourself. You do other things. It doesn't mean you don't like people and you don't react to people. Indeed, you need the stimulus of people, and you need the stimulus of their minds and their ideas, okay, to get a feel and to get a synthesis of what your thoughts might be in this realm. So I think that all of a sudden being exposed, as I have been over the last 4 or 5 years, but particularly in the last 4 or 5 months, for a private person is something that you get over. I think if I wrote all the wish lists of what I'd like to do again, okay, probably being a TV star is not one of them. But on the other hand, I must say that people have been extremely nice to me and have treated me very well and have treated me very fairly. And so I come away with a very positive feeling.
Pretend like you're talking to somebody that doesn't own any stock, that has never really thought about the New York Stock Exchange, doesn't know what it means, and try to describe for us what it's all about. How big an institution is it? You're the chairman of the board, CEO. What does that mean? And what are your duties?
Okay. Well, I'd like to frame it even bigger than that for a minute. Okay. I think that the equities markets in this country, which we call stock market in this country, are really the nation's greatest asset. They have several major functions. One of them is to provide a liquid market after a company sells stock. Okay, so that company can invest that money in the sale of the stock in plant and equipment and services and other things. That those plants and equipment and services produce jobs, and hopefully they produce earnings, and they produce eventually a higher standard of living for everybody in the United States, and hopefully a better quality of life. The second function of an exchange itself in the equities markets is a kind of asset management function in those individuals and institutions that are investing or someday in the future may be investing, that provide that liquidity to that market, that allow corporations to raise money, to allow new companies to start, to go public, to draw down the resources of these capital markets, to begin to grow, and in growing to bring all the people that have an interest in them provide new jobs and new employment and everything else. All of that really goes on in the stock market in the United States. So it is a very, very important function that it performs, and it affects the lives of every American almost in one way or another. In investing, there are about 47 million individuals who own stocks. About another 140 million Americans are indirect owners, that is through pension funds, through IRAs, through Keoghs, through other things like that. So there's a significant portion of the population that is invested in one way or another. But most importantly, in the last 5 years, for instance, the amount of jobs created in this country have come from new and emerging companies who weren't there 5 or 8 or 10 years ago. We just listed a company recently called Tandem, which is an electronics company in California, started in 1976. Within 10 years, it's $1 billion company. Within 10 years, some of the volume, for instance, that we did in October was done through Tandem computers, which we could not have done a number of years ago. And that company not only has provided services to everybody, but provided new jobs over the last 10 years, and contributed not only to the standard of living in the areas and where it exists, but to a quality of life as well. Now, within the exchange itself, it's an extremely interesting job because the board of directors is made up of 27 people. 10 of which who are from the industry in different categories in the industry, institutional type firms, retail firms, regional firms based outside New York area, specialty firms, those that are in the tri-state area that compete against the majors in some way, and 3 people from the floor as well. We also have 10 directors that are public directors that come from any walk of life, including a former SEC commissioner today, former chairman of major corporations and so forth, and they bring that balance to it. And then we have a...
How do they get there, by the way?
They get there by an independent nominating committee, which is very unusual for a corporation. Mostly the nominating committees of corporations have people from the board on the nominating committee, or the chairman is on the nominating committee. In our state, that is not so. We have a nominating committee made up of 10 public people, 4 public people and 4 industry people, who nominate the next nominating committee, and they provide the directors for the board of directors when there is an opening. I go before them once a year to tell them about the needs of the exchange and what we're doing and the kinds of directors they need. And hopefully there's a dialogue back and forth, but they are independent and they provide us with the directors. And an interesting sidelight to that is, and every once in a while we send people up to the Advanced Management School at Harvard, and we go up there as a sponsors day once in a while. And I listen to all these corporate CEOs talk about how they get directors and how they nominate them and everything else. And then I say to them, well, now I'll give you something. How would you like to? I've had directors come on the board that I've never met before in my life, okay? And everybody's horrified by that. But yet the system works very well. We give them good orientation, we get them involved very well, and so that it's certainly not an old boy system that we run.
There's one in, is the New York Stock Exchange a business?
It is what we call a not-for-profit business, which is halfway between, or I like to call it a not-for-loss business. All right? It's you have to earn profits in order to invest in the future. But it's halfway between a not-for-profit organization and a publicly owned corporation, and it's a special category created in New York State, which basically says we're a quasi-public institution. We can make a profit, we pay taxes like everybody else, but because of our constituent base, we are really more of a public institution than a private or publicly owned corporation.
I got a question I want to ask you, I'm afraid I'm going to forget it. Why does the New York Stock Exchange, I guess, Foundation sponsor, I believe it's the Marvin Cow interviews with presidential candidates? Is that
yes,
right?
That's right.
Why? That all of a sudden seemed new to me. I didn't see that.
Well, it is reasonably new. The foundation started about 4 years ago, and it's been funding some of the things that the foundation thinks it ought to do as a good citizen out there in the world, and basically had been doing things in the local city area. This opportunity came up through the Kennedy School, and it seemed to be a public service that speaks to the functions that we talk about, because we talked about the equity markets and its function. But because of all the constituents the exchange has, and the exchange has the individual investor, the institution, the listed companies who list their stocks there, the member firms who people that daily work within that marketplace, people like yourself and the press and the media who are constantly interested in it. We have oversight committees from the SEC, for instance, and from the House and from the Senate, and we hold a whole panoply of people both in the economy and government who one way or another are directly or indirectly interested in what the exchange does, interested in its capital raising function. So we have a great public affairs role to play, all right? And interestingly enough, because we have so many constituencies, we kind of can act as a neutral middle ground, all right, where we can pull together a notable person and bring in a variety of people to discuss a variety of subjects. So I think the foundation thought that as an extension of that exchange role, but being within the foundation itself, what could be more important than the American public seeing a variety of candidates who were thinking about running for the presidency in 1988, and we had this opportunity to sponsor it at the Kennedy School, which is another neutral arena, and so we thought that might be a good opportunity. At least the board did. I'm not on the board.
Of the foundation?
Yeah, the foundation has its own board, and the foundation thought that that was a good opportunity to continue and further the public role of the New York Stock Exchange Foundation. And so they sponsored it, and it's an interesting experiment, and I hope they'll be pleased with it.
Let's go back to the New York Stock Exchange. How many Well, first of all, is it the largest in the world?
Yes.
What's the next in size?
Tokyo, and it depends on how you calculate size, but they're about 2/3 of what they are now, and then the third largest is London.
How long has Tokyo and London been that close in size to the New York Stock Exchange?
Tokyo has been growing quite rapidly. We've been growing, but they've been growing very rapidly. And London was a very, very small exchange, although it's the third largest in the world, even in the last 10 years. But they've done some reorganization, they've done some deregulation, they've opened it up, and so it's a much more active exchange than it was a few years ago. Tokyo is constantly growing. They had a major exchange there 10 years ago, but nobody really talked about it. It's only been in the last 5 years as Japan has become more and more into prominence that everybody begins to talk about the Tokyo Stock Exchange. So if you get up at 6:30 in the morning and turn on the television, they're already giving you what the Tokyo market did and what the London market did and what yen is doing and what...
Let me ask you a question on that point. Is it my imagination, or is it just since the, quote, meltdown, that you hear about the Japan and London or Tokyo Stock Exchange reports in the morning? It seems like there's more of that. Or have they always been there? I'm just noticing it.
Well, no, there's more of them, and I think there's a greater consciousness of it. I mean, everybody said we're in a world market today. Well, that's right and not right. We're tending more towards that way, but we're certainly in a world where the communications link the markets together in some way. And because for a while all those markets moved in tandem the week of the October 19th, there was a fixation about what Tokyo was doing and what London was doing. But quite quickly, after a couple of days, they really disconnected, and they went in their own ways under local conditions. So I think, yes, there is more an awareness of that. But these things are quite trendy. I mean, you know, everybody used to watch the money supply years ago. Now it's the trade deficit every month. One day they're watching the yen and the Deutschmark, and the next time something else. But I think there is more of a desire by all kinds of people, not only in the financial industry, to have a better understanding of what's going on in the world and how they're interconnected, if in fact they are. And so you do hear in the morning now much more than you did before about Tokyo and London and other places.
How many people work for you, the New York Stock Exchange?
We have 1,900 people who work directly for the exchange, and we own 2/3 of a subsidiary called the Securities Industry Automation Corporation, which does the back end for us and most member firms, and another 1,200 in there. So we've got in all you know, almost 4,000 people. And now my job as CEO is that of any other chief executive officer. We're to lay out the future, do the planning, make sure the place runs right. I have a president and chief operating officer, Bob Birnbaum, who takes care of the operations side of the business. But it's also almost like being a congressman or a senator, too, because you have all these constituents out there. We have, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12 advisory committees to the board now. We have a regional firms advisory committee, an institutional traders advisory committee, an upstairs traders advisory committee. This morning, just before I came up here, we had a 3-hour meeting with the listed company advisory committee. What we try to do is bring all those constituents in together and to get their input on policy matters. And we kind of run it as a consensus organization. So you have to pay a lot of attention to the constituent groups as well. And you do a lot of explaining, like we're doing here today, about what the exchange is and why it is and why it's important to this country and to the people of this country, and why other people should be interested in it, and where it's going in the future and so forth. So there's an awful lot of that, and so that gets back to the earlier questions about press and interviews and things like that. There's a great deal of public exposure that probably wasn't there 5 to 7 years ago.
Again, I don't know, it's my imagination, but it seems like in recent years a lot of public figures, including yourself, and I'm thinking of Secretary of State Schultz and former White House Chief of Staff Don Regan and the chairman of the board of Time Inc., and many others have been Marine Corps veterans. You're a Marine Corps veteran, I believe.
Yes, that's correct.
What impact did the Marine Corps have on your life? I mean, is there something the Marine Corps does that prepares you to be CEO of a major operation like this?
Well, I don't know. I think that in my life there probably be, 4 or 5 major impacts. One certainly is the family and growing up. And secondly is your education. Third is your religion and what he teaches you. And fourth, the business you grew up in. And I think in my life also, fifth has been my wife. Okay, we've been married almost 33 years, and she's had a profound impact on my life. I think what the Marine Corps at least did for me was it taught me a great deal of self-discipline, to learn about privation in life. I was in Korea with it for a year in 1951, 1952. It taught you about hardship, about suffering, about toughing it out, getting it through, to teach you endurance, both mental and physical. And so, but I think most of all, out of all that experience, it taught me a confidence in myself, okay, that no matter how hard times got, that I was able to endure them. And if it was true in that experience, then probably it was true for most of the other experiences in life. And so that you find yourself, even after 30-something years, at least mentally, if not articulating, okay, different phrases that you learn there. And I think you think back to different disciplines that you learn. In business and in education, you learn the mental discipline and the accumulation of knowledge as well, and that kind of all fits together in there. And I suppose it fits together in the value system as well. Okay? And I think that I grew up in a value system that talked about hard work and discipline and responsibility and making sure you have that responsibility. And I think that was echoed and reinforced in my Marine Corps experience as well.
Born and raised in this city?
I was born in New York City and raised on Long Island, a place called Garden City.
What did your parents do?
My father was a stockbroker, and had a very funny experience with him. When I was 16 years old and I was still in high school, he said to me one summer, maybe you'd like to come down and work for me down in the exchange. And so I did for a summer. And my father was a reasonably frugal man, and he didn't spoil me with giving me too much money. And so what he paid me for the summer, every week, by the time I got in on the train and came out and had my lunch, I hardly had anything left at all. And so at the end of the summer, not only that, but you came down and it was a place that I was unaccustomed to. Was busy and noisy, and people were gruff, and for a young kid it was hard to get in to tell anybody tell you what was going on, and they'd push you around and do all this other things. So I said at the end of the summer, he said, well, how did you like it? And I said, well, I don't know what I'm going to do in my life, but I'll tell you one thing. I said, I'm never going to work in Wall Street again.
What changed your mind?
Oh, I think later on, after I was married, and an opportunity came up down there, and I suppose I looked at it in a different way. And once I got into it and really got interested and began to understand it and study it a little more, the markets just absolutely fascinated me, because it had to do with the fundamental background of why things trade and how they trade. But it all has to do with the psychology of people as well, and the interaction of people and knowledge and everything else. And it really has a lot of things wrapped up that have to do with life. And so that the more I learned about it, the more I got hooked on it. And so I became a student of markets and, again, dealing with people and other things like that. And I've been hooked on it ever since.
What about education?
Well, I went to Adelphi University in Garden City, Long Island. And I was one of the, every once in a while you get very lucky in life, and Adelphi did a great deal with me. Gave me a good education, it gave me a broad education, and I was able to come back in 1980 as the first alumni chairman of that university, in a period of time where it was undergoing a change. It was having a drop in student enrollment. It had to make some changes out there, and at least I think I helped to get it through a difficult period, and it's quite prosperous and going quite well now. So I was very fortunate to be able to put something back in, which I think is very important for life for people like ourselves who've been reasonably fortunate.
Notice in your bio that there's a lot of reference to a lot of different. One that I remember, Catholic Charities, but you've been involved in a lot of extra work outside of the business. What's your philosophy of that? How much should an American business person do with that?
Well, I think that gets back to the thing that I just mentioned, that I was taught in growing up. I guess my father was as instilled that in me as much as anyone, that as long as you're eating and you've got a house over your roof over your head and everything else, you're fortunate than most people in this world, and that the more you take out of it, the more you owe back into it. And I think that I've grown up with that philosophy, so that charities was one of those things I got into early because he had been involved, and he died in 1966, but I carried on and had an interest in that. The other thing with the exchange was that there are so many races and nationalities involved in the exchange itself, and I mean it's literally a melting pot if you come down there. So that early on we were interested in the relationships between religions and races and things like that. So I got interested in the National Conference and in the B'nai B'rith and those kinds of organizations as well. And a lot of people of different backgrounds and religions have been very kind to me over a period of time. And so that I think that comes out of my educational background and my business background. And so had a great deal of interest in people working together, people thinking about each other. And I've been taught to say that you also got to care about people who are less fortunate than yourself. And so all of that has come through, I think, all those organizations that you see. They really have something to do with other people, whether it be in charity or working together as a group, and in education, too. See,
right.
If I may just add one other thing, I think education is the great key to entrance into our society. And we all come from immigrant forefathers at one time or another. And two things have played the most important part in that integration in our society. One is access to the economic system, and the other one is access to the educational system. And those are the two things that provide upward mobility in this country. And those are the two things, basically, that I really have tried to work on, plus the fact that everybody doesn't make it the first time around, and so you have got to spend some time making sure there's an institutional way to care for those that are less fortunate.
What is your ancestry? Where does it go back to? What grandmothers, did your grandfather come over from?
No, it probably goes back further than that. I didn't, I think it goes back to about 1860-something during the Civil War. I think most of my relatives came here from Ireland. And, you know, one way or another over a period of time found their way into society and worked out. I don't come from a big family, but one of my interesting experiences since I've had this job, I get letters from Phalans all over the world. I get them from New Zealand and Australia and people in Europe and Canada. And apparently there's one group of them that meets every Christmas, 125 of them outside Toronto, and have invited me to that. I had one woman in Santa Barbara send me the enlistment papers for a great-great-grandfather in the Civil War. His name was John J. Phelan, Jr., and wanted to know if I was any relation to that. And I always tell people that apparently my people left Ireland in a great hurry because they left all their possessions there, including the family tree, so that I don't really know what those links are. But it's quite fascinating.
Because you work so much in your extracurricular activities with people of different races and different backgrounds, what is it that causes people not to get along, in your opinion? Where's the rift come in between religions and people?
I think it's insecurity and ignorance, really. People are insecure in their own place in society. They see everybody else coming up around them to be a threat to that. And so most of the things that I've seen in that area come basically from that. In the area, for instance, in the Florida Exchange, we've got all kinds of races, and they're quite open about these ethical differences and kid each other about it and so forth. And that openness and that kidding really gets everybody to work together. And I suppose if you ever looked at what you thought America might be in its ultimate, you would look in trading arenas like that, because there it doesn't make any difference whether you're black, white, yellow, or pink, or whether you've got a PhD or you're a high school dropout. It really has to do with how talented you are in that area. And so that it's one of those things. And interestingly enough, the financial district in New York, being located in Lower Manhattan, is where all the waves of immigrants have come since almost the beginning of our nation. And the exchange will be 200 years old in 1992, and each of those waves has really come through the financial district and worked and found opportunities and upward mobility within those areas. So I mean, it really is an integral part of the life in this country, and the new dynamics and strength of people from foreign lands coming in.
Did you say 47 million people in this country out of 250 million have stock?
Yes, one form or another.
Do they buy it usually through a broker? I mean, is that...
Yeah, they do. Sometimes they get the majority are through brokers. There are other ways that ESOPs and things like that, they acquire it as well, but mostly through brokers.
I've heard a number of people over the last couple of months say, I might as well get on an airplane and fly to Vegas and throw the crapshoot. It'd be a lot easier than buying stocks. I'm sure you've heard that. That's not new to you. What do you tell that person that says it's nothing but a gambling?
Well, I said that we're as worried about it as they are. And we get back to talking about the market as one of the greatest national asset today outside of its people. That market is to do, as we talked about before, is to raise capital. So, and to have a continuous market for people who want to buy and sell equities reasonably quickly, so that all that money is invested in the United States, okay, in people and jobs and everything else. This volatility that is entered into the market is unnerving not only to individuals but to institutions as well. I mean, there's only 13,000 institutions that use the market in one form or another. Every listed company there has a pension fund that in some way invests in that market. And all those people all over this country are concerned about this constant up and downs and this constant instability that there is in the atmosphere at the present time. We're trying to see what causes that instability, and we're trying to see if we can't smooth it out to some way. We share their concerns. I think that what we all need together is to take a look at it, reflect those concerns to the people that are involved, not only the oversight people in Congress and the SEC, but the users of the market themselves, to the people who participate in pension funds, the people who do the investing, and to say, listen, what is it that we can all do to dampen this volatility, to bring it back where it's supposed to be, is a kind of investment and asset management tool that isn't a daily speculation game or crap game in which everybody's throwing around billions and billions of dollars. And I think that's really the main challenge that's coming out of October, is what are the equity markets in this country going to be in the future? And are they going to be just for a few professional investors who've driven everybody out so they can get that volatility to make money? Or are they going to be, as they have been in the past, the strength of this country, which attracts new capital into the marketplace, attracts new companies into the marketplace, and builds that strength that we need so desperately in this country today? And that's the main question coming out of October 19th, not all these other nits in there. So I share their concerns, and we need their help as well to talk to the people who invest their money, whether directly or indirectly, to say, listen, we've all got to work together here to get some stability back into the marketplace and not let the speculators take it over.
A couple of quick technical questions. How does a company become a member of the New York Stock Exchange, and has its stock traded?
It applies for listing. It has to have a certain number of years of earnings. It has to have a certain size.
What's the cutoff on size?
Oh, I think it's about 100 million, something like that. It's quite small.
A year, gross revenue?
Yeah, right. And it's got to have 2,000 round lot shareholders. So there's enough shareholder base so some continuous market can be made by it.
Who makes that decision?
And they do.
I mean, who makes the decision on whether or not they get on they're traded on the New York Stock Exchange?
They do.
They meaning
the company itself. Right. We're constantly out talking to them as they begin to grow and meet the requirements. But they decide, and their board of directors decide as to whether they want to list or not.
They pay you?
Right. They pay us a listing fee and a continuous listing.
Can you be listed on the New York Stock Exchange and the American Stock Exchange?
Oh, yeah. Well, yes, usually not listed on the American, but usually listed on all the regional exchanges. And in any number of them are listed in London as well, and some of them are listed in Tokyo. So there's any number of dual listings.
Having seen the New York Stock Exchange, the floor of the New York Stock Exchange on television, I'm sure hundreds of times in my life, this is a simplistic question. Why does it have to be that way? I mean, I get the impression that things are being thrown around and people are talking to one another, and I mean, how can business be done that way?
Well, what's happening is business is being done in one unit, just like you and I, all right? You are a specialist in a stock, and I'm coming in to buy or sell, and there are some other people around us who are buyers and sellers as well, all right? And that's being duplicated 1,600 times, because there are 1,600 stocks listed there. And whether you go on the floor of an exchange or you go in a trading room where they're trading government bonds, there are people shouting at each other and talking in the phones. It is a very hectic, high-pressured type of existence. Trading always is that way. And whether it's here, whether it's in currency markets, whether in bond markets as well. But in recent years, we've used an enormous amount of electronic support to route orders in and out of the market to get up to anybody that's interested as quickly as possible, information that's coming off those markets as well. So that if you take each one of those segments, they're not hectic unto themselves. As you put them all together, they are very hectic.
You're a historian by either training or by hobby?
Inclination, maybe. Yeah. I think that, what's it, Santayana, we're doomed to repeat the same mistakes. We don't learn from the past, and so I think that that's true.
What was your degree in?
It was in business.
On a historical perspective on what's going on, did you had premonitions that the October 19th was going to happen. You said it out loud and all that. Was that come from cycles or history or just other reasons that you do it?
It comes from experience in the marketplace and the fact that if everybody is looking for the same trigger points, that eventually they'll all hit them at the same time. And you know, Murphy's Law, you know, what can go wrong will go wrong at some point in time. But I also have learned over the years and I've studied and talked to other people who've used mathematical formulas for investing, and all of them work very well when periods of calm, and all of them have an Achilles heel somewhere. And the main Achilles heel is psychology, and the market is made up of fact and psychology, and when the psychology turns, and that distorts the mathematical formula. Even the Black-Scholes model, which a lot of these hedging vehicles are based on and so forth, says that you must have a stable market in order to do that. But we all know that in our atmosphere, our human atmosphere, and the atmosphere in which we live, the environment is not always stable. I mean, you get unstable times, and during those unstable times, all those neat, put them in a drawer and wrap them up nicely type of things just don't work. And that's the fascinating thing about markets, is every time everybody thinks they've got it figured out and beaten, okay, it always comes back and takes it away. So it has a great leveling influence to the egos, all right? And traders in general have enormous egos, and every once in a while they get very deflated, and I think that's part of the leveling influence of it. So I think my interest is in studying the markets as well, and movements and everything else. And it just seemed to me obvious that once you get enough people plugged into the fact that when it goes down 10%, you sell 20% of your portfolio and so forth and so on, that if enough people think that, it'll happen. And not only it'll happen, but it'll go to the next trigger point and the next trigger point. And it just seemed to be as obvious as tomorrow is Friday.
One of the other things you keep reading is that you're given a lot of credit for computerizing the markets. And then the next step, and I'm sure I'm not right about this, I'm sure you can explain it, that there is some blame laid on the computerization for the whole event happening. Am I?
No, I think they're both right. In the first place, we'd learned a terrible lesson in the late 60s, and where we had more volume than we could handle, and we lost about 1/3 of all the member firms during that period of time. Although, fortunately, in one of the great private initiative rescues of our history or anybody else's history, all those people who had accounts in those firms were saved by the firms putting up about $200 million to make sure they didn't lose their money. But out of that, we had to fight technology in the old days. We obviously had to embrace it, to take it, to use it, to help us with it, okay? Not so that it would overcome you, but help to do what people do in the market, take away the redundancy, take away a lot of the paperwork and other things like that, but the mental process of making that decision is still there with the individual. So we spent a lot of time and a lot of money on it. And we have a very elaborate planning cycle at the exchange, and that's what I'm saying. In October, in theory, our capacity was about 450 million. That means the member firm capacity was about the same. In 1991 and 1992, it estimated we would have to do about 600 million. Well, I mean, on October 19th, 1992 arrived, right? And so we did 600 million and a theoretical capacity of 450 million. So obviously we had more built in there than we thought we had before. But at the same time, when this hedging vehicle developed out of the futures markets, it was the routing systems and execution systems that we put in that enabled you almost simultaneously to buy a future and sell 500 stocks, or sell a future and buy 500 stocks. And they began to use our system, first very slowly and then greater and greater. And that also had a challenge in changing our capacity as well. So one, yes, we have used computers, and we never would have gotten through this whole business if we hadn't spent all that time on automation. And yes, as a fallout from that, we also provided the road and highway in, which led to a lot of the problems that came about on the 19th by the use of computer trading. But I don't think you can reject technology. I mean, technology is here to come, communications is here to come. I think that the trick in the future is, one, you don't over-position because you think you've got a perfect hedge on the other side based on some mathematical formula. It just doesn't work. And secondly, that you can't use technology to disadvantage or give an advantage to one small segment of the investing population. and that everybody coming down the highway has got to come at the same speed. And so I think that we have to continue to use technology, but perhaps we have to slow it down for some people and accelerate it for others, so they come in a fair access and an even playing field. And I think that challenge is ours in the future, which is to continue to use technology and upgrade it, but make sure, okay, that one doesn't come with a greater speed than the other and shut out the other.
I suspect that nobody knows American business people better than you do, or at least you've met hundreds of thousands of them. Pretend for a moment that you've been invited to a seminar or a group of them sitting around a table, and they say, John Phelan, with all your experience, tell us where we're going wrong. You've seen trends. What should we do to, and I'm not talking about the stock market, I'm just talking about American business in the next 10 years. What would you advise them?
But I think I'd advise them to do what they've been doing now. I mean, you get prosperous for a while, and then we went in the 60s, 50s and 60s was very prosperous for this country. And then we went through this inflationary period. We're probably on a real money basis. Corporations were not making money in the 70s, but we're actually losing them you take the inflation out of the earnings rate. We'd also had a lot of old plant and equipment for a variety of reasons, including external competition. The quality of our products weren't that good. But I think in the 80s you saw a renewed drive within American business to compete again, first domestically and then overseas. The overseas competition is slowly coming out now. The domestic is more. Everybody, you know, we all talked about the Rust Belt in the middle and early and middle 80s. You don't hear people talking about that anymore. That was the Midwest. A lot of new production facilities have come into being in the last 4 or 5 years. Other production facilities gotten more efficient. We've had a very painful transition within the labor force, and a lot of it has occurred in the middle management group, just not on the assembly line of production facilities. So I think what has to happen is for firms to become more productive, to get their employees more involved in the decision-making process. So it's more of a partnership, to bring the best of a small business to the large business and vice versa. And so I think productivity and better management of not only our financial assets, but our human assets. And I think that this country, again, will feel a great deal better about itself, and we still are the major economic force in this world today, despite what everybody says. And I think we're no longer on the decline, we're on the upswing again. And I think it's because management is thinking about competition, about productivity, about better use of the human capital and bringing them into the decision-making process more. And I think that success will flow out into the 90s.
How do you feel about the Ivan Boeskys?
Well, I feel about just disgusted. And there are a few people that are privileged in this world, and somebody like Boesky was a privileged person. He understood through his education, his experience, the working of markets. He gathered the trust of people and other things, and he violated those trusts. And so he violated them for his own personal gain, and the system was good to him. I mean, he didn't have to cheat to make money in the system, all right? That's one of the things that I really believe about the American system, is you don't have to cheat to make money and be prosperous in the system. And somebody whom the system has embraced and whom the system trusted, and after all, he was the head of a firm. And when a head of a firm goes bad, I mean, that goes all the way down the barrel. And so the Boeskys of this world, unfortunately, you continue to have them from time to time. I think you've got to drive them out. You've got to make sure that the punishments for them are severe. And I think you've got to teach a whole new generation coming up that that's not the way to do business. I mean, I look at everybody blames the yuppies on the Boesky business. I don't blame the yuppies. I blame my generation, okay? My generation was taught a discipline and a standard coming into our business that's not there today. And it's up to our generation to instruct the new people coming into the business about a decent standard. And yeah, you're there to make money, but more than making money, okay? You're there to, if you're going to have a decent business and a decent service, you've got to have your customer base have confidence in you. And you don't have confidence, they don't build confidence, you don't build ethics and morality by ripping everybody off. You build it by building and delivering a decent product and having people trust in you because you have treated them fairly and well. And that's the only way you can do business in this country. It's the only way you can do business in the world.
Just a few minutes left. Be interested in knowing who your favorite people are in history.
In history? Mm-hmm. I don't know. I've never been I've never been a I've never really worried about myself because I never had heroes or idols, and I don't know whether I grew up in a skeptical generation, or there were a lot of people that I followed in history, and a lot of people that I've read about and so forth. But I think that if I ever had to think about people and you know, pick out one group, I would think of the people who founded this country. They did an absolutely amazing job. They broke off from the mother country, which certainly could not have been an easy thing to do. They framed a constitution, even though they all had self-interest and everything else. Despite all the heckling and all the comments about its inefficiency, works as well today as it did when they put it into place. I heard Senator Moynihan one time talk about it when he was permanent representative of the UN, and there was a plaque behind him when he was sitting there of all the countries listed in the UN, or members of the UN, and he asked how many countries that were there since 1776 and haven't had their government changed by revolution, and I think there were only 2 and we were 1, something like that. Then he went to 1850 and there were 4 or 5, then he went to 1914 and there maybe were 17, and even today there were a very small number. And I think that those people who put it together, and the people who came after him, and there were some great leaders after that, but this country today has political stability, has economic stability, and is the refuge for all the people in the world who seek to come here for opportunity. And you look at that statue in the Lower Bay that the French children paid to give us 100 years ago or so. The saying on this, and this, you're lame and you're sick and you're poor and so forth. The same thing is going on today. In that 100 years, there hasn't been a better place in the world to come, a better place to try to make a home, a better place to try to raise children, and a better place that offered better opportunity no matter who you were or where you were from than this country today. And surely those people back in our inception put together something that I'm not sure whether they ever knew how it was going to work out in the long run, but really were exceptional people to have put in place so many principles and ideas that carry through even today.
You were ahead of the game. You predicted what would happen prior to what it did in October. Will you take a shot at the future of the country, given both the market situation and the deficit and the political campaign? What's it going to be like for us in the next 10 years?
Well, I think that those are all short-term problems and everything else. You got to be bullish on America. I mean, there isn't a better place in the world like it. You've got to see its warts, and you've got to understand its problems and everything else. And it has problems, but so does everybody else through history. I think that one of the problems with Americans is that they kind of believe in instant tea. You know, you pour some hot water into a thing and dip a tea bag up and down, you have wonderful tea. You don't solve problems by dipping tea bags in hot water. But I think if you look out 10 years, yeah, we've got trade problems, we've got competitive problems, we've got educational problems in this country that are just unbelievable. But I think somewhere, if you look out, I think those problems will get better. We will be more competitive, both internally and externally in the world in the next 10 years. I think we're beginning to see a turnaround in our educational system, an importance of educating people again, not to get PhDs, but to get a good secondary school education and good high school education and hopefully get people to go on to college. But education in other fields as well, rather than academic fields, so that we have good educated workers in this country who have multiple skills that can be moved from one kind of a job to another and so forth. And I think that we have horrendous problems having to do with the aged. Our population is growing older. We've got to have somewhere in that line to provide catastrophe insurance for health and all the other things, to do it in a way that probably isn't solely government, but both private and public partnership in that area as well. We've got all those kinds of problems, but yet I think when you come down to it, we won't, if you sit down 10 years from now, we talk about the same thing. We probably won't have come to an ultimate solution to any one of those things, but I think we'll be a lot further down the road, and still at that point in time, I think that with all our problems and with all the difficulties, we'll still be the best country in the world to live and to bring your children up in.
About 4 minutes left. What's a day in the life of John Phelan look like?
Well, it starts about 7:30 in the morning, and it takes me 15 minutes to come down the East Side Drive. I look at some things that have come in late yesterday or overnight. I always have a business breakfast, either with some constituent group or client, as we like to say. Mostly with that, sometimes internally to do that. By 8:15 or 8:30, the exchange is running very well and very fast. Like today, we had a listed company advisory committee meeting. I did that. I talked with a number of people from different firms. I talked to a couple of listed companies on the phone. I had lunch with another group of people having to do with the member firm community as well. This interview this afternoon is one of many types of communications interviews we do from time to time. I will go to a dinner tonight. This one Joyce can't go with, but most of the time she can go. We'll have some involvement in business as well. We also had a brief planning session of looking at, we have a 2-day off-site and doing an environmental scan the end of this month, and so we had a brief discussion on that as well. I talked about the congressional testimony that's coming up in February on a variety of issues, and it probably will wind down about 10:30 tonight.
What's the toughest thing you do every day in your normal job day?
The toughest thing I do every day is endemic to my job, okay, is that everybody has a complaint and everybody wants that complaint solved right away. I think that basically is the toughest thing. And to keep the second toughest thing I think is to get out of the short term and keep reaching out as an individual and an institution, and not being bogged down in the day-to-day details and scheduling. So I think that probably if I had to re-answer that question, I'd say the schedule is the toughest thing, not getting bogged down in that.
Is being chairman of the New York Stock Exchange the ultimate for you in the business world? Is that it?
I don't really know. I hadn't thought about it. I kind of hoped there was something else. And, you know, I just... you can plan and scheme as much as you'd like in life, and you lay out 5- and 10-year plans, but sometimes it almost seems that life is a series of serendipitous events as well. I never thought in my life that I'd be chairman of the stock exchange, and I don't know what's out there again, but hopefully it's interesting, and hopefully it'll be something that I enjoy, and hopefully since I'm 57, that at least I'll have one more interesting role in life before it's all over.
John Phelan, chairman of the New York Stock Exchange, thank you very much for taking this time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.